Hi, this is Colleen C. Perry. Today I'm going to be doing a book review on the modern practice of adult education, from pedagogy to andragogy. This is a book written by Malcolm Knowles, published in 1980. The purpose of this book review is actually twofold. First thing I wanted to do was learn a little bit more about andragogy. A little bit of background for me is actually in my experience in the adult education program. My class with the adult learner was quite different than most. So there's a lot of things that, while I've had experience with the terminology and I know a little bit about it, this class was able to give me a lot more information and point me in the right direction. So first thing I wanted to do with this book was to learn a lot more about andragogy and as it relates to adult education. Furthermore, I really wanted to know a little bit more about its practical use. How does knowing about andragogy actually translate into practical practice? And really, this book was able to do that for me. Furthermore, I wanted to be able to use this book review as a chance to create a study tool for my peers as we prepare for comps. Hope that this will be helpful to you. A little bit about the book. This is a revision from Mr. Knowles' 1970 book entitled The Modern Practice of Adult Education, Andragogy versus Pedagogy. However, Knowles revised this title, as I said, in 1980, as he had some shift in his thinking and it needed time to be updated. One thing to point out here that we're going to discuss further is that andragogy is not necessarily better than pedagogy, but really another model to be used when we're teaching. This book is divided into 3 parts. The first book being about the emerging role of technology in adult education. The second is organizing and administering comprehensive programs of adult education. And the third and final chapter really has to do with helping adults learn. The highlights of part 1 were actually pretty vast. First thing that it talks about was modern trends in adult education. Really talks a little bit about why it exists and how the process of adults learn. It also talks about the role of educators. One of the things that stood out to me is to produce competent people. That was quoted on page 19 of this book. And then finally, also this section talks about andragogy versus pedagogy, which we're going to talk about a little bit more detail. A couple more things to point out is that really chapter 3, where it talks about the role of adult educators, really is a great read for all of us in our program. It may not be the most useful for comps, but it is something that all of us need to be reminded of. Knowles works in this chapter to define what adult education is. It is easy to know what elementary education is, but yet defining adult education can be difficult. He really breaks it into 3 sections. One is that adult education can describe the process of how adults learn. It can also describe the set of organized activities by various institutions for accomplishment of the educational objectives. And finally, it describes the social practice of teaching with particular methods. And finally, like I said, we're going to talk more about andragogy and pedagogy when we get to that part. So, part 2 highlights. The section 2 is really all about taking the andragogical process assumptions and process elements and putting them into program planning. I really like this section because it was practical. It might be the thing that I love most about adult education. I've learned in my experience that everything that we tend to learn in these classes actually is exactly how it's applied in the real practice. And to me, that makes a lot of sense to me. If I were teaching an HRD class, I definitely think that it would work to incorporate these chapters into the learning process. As I read through them, I really found myself thinking more about all that I learned in the HRD class, program planning, and even curriculum construction. I found myself pleased to be served with these reminders on such things as the ADDIE model and even curriculum construction. So again, I really do find that this book is a must-read for everyone, but some of these chapters may not be the most imperative things that we need to be studying as it relates to our comps. So finally on section 3 of this textbook. What it talks about more is more detail regarding setting a climate for learning. I feel this is also a good read for adult educators. It reminded me of the old saying, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. As adult educators, it really is imperative that all of our beginning steps, from advertising adult learning activities to registration for them, and even the beginning of each class, is really going to set the tone for how the learning is going to occur and how people are going to feel comfortable learning. It is really up to us as educators to set up a warm, trusting climate right away. And things such as bad administration of getting the registration put together can actually alter that climate. A couple things to point out as well is that there's a really good section on learning contracts. I would consider that a must read. And this section is followed by pages upon pages of appendix and exhibits. Lots of really good things that Mr. Knowles put together in this book to really make it comprehensive. So how is this going to help with our comps? Well, first we're going to talk about what is andragogy. We know that this is the art and science of helping adults learn. That's different from pedagogy, which is the art and science of teaching children. It really is another model to be used when teaching adults and even children when possible. There's some evidence to support that children can learn using an andragogical framework. Of course, we as educators need to be able to pinpoint when that might be necessary. And the same is true for pedagogy techniques with adults. There's a time and there's a place. And andragogy is a set of assumptions that defines how adults learn. This was put together by Mr. Knowles. Here on this sheet, that might be a little bit hard to read on the video, but if anybody wants to have this PowerPoint sent to them, please let me know and I'd be happy to email it to you. But these are assumptions of andragogy. They are concept of learner, role of learner's experience, the readiness to learn, time in learning, orientation to learning, and motivation. I did put time in learning in italics as these were not actually part of this book, but we know them to be part of the assumptions now. So talking through each one, we know that the concept of the learner in pedagogy is actually dependent, meaning that the learner depends on the teacher, whereas in andragogy it's actually independent and they're more autonomous. The role of the learner in andragogy really takes experience as a rich resource. And adults come to the table ready to learn what they need to learn when they need to learn it. In contrast to pedagogy, where a student learns something because they're told that that's the next lesson, the plan that they're to build upon. In regards to time for learning, children in the pedagogy model, their time is out of little concern. Whereas in andragogy, we really need to be concerned with this because adults' time is precious and we need to be able to make the most of it. In terms of orientation to learning, adults come to the table to learn something because they're task-centered, they have an immediate need. Where again, pedagogy is more those students are being told what to learn. In terms of motivation, we know that adults are motivated by intrinsic rewards more so than pedagogy, which is external. There are 7 process elements. They include climate, planning, diagnosis of needs, setting of objectives, designing learning plans, designing learning activities, and evaluation. The biggest thing to point out here is, of course, in pedagogy, that everything is very much authoritative instructor-led. They're in charge of building the syllabus, to define the lesson plans and the learning activities. They do the evaluation at the end of the students with little to no input from the students. But with pedagogy, we know that, with andragogy, it's much different than that. Again, we're working with adults. Their time is precious, and in most cases, they could even be actually paying for their education versus society paying for it. So in that regard, they have different demands. One is the climate must be warm and relaxing, must be trusting. They want to be able to come to the table, feel comfortable learning what they need to learn, and get on their way. When it comes to planning what's going to be done, if it can be done mutually, that is great. If it can't be done mutually at the time of the learning, then representatives from the people who are going to be learning should be involved in the planning process as much as possible. When diagnosing the learning needs of the person at hand, that should be mutual as well. So should the setting objectives based upon the individual needs of the learner. In terms of learning plans, instead of someone just saying, okay, well, you're going to read this chapter and take this quiz, we talk more about learning contracts, where the adult comes to the table saying, listen, okay, from my needs, I know that I need to learn how to use Google. So here's going to be my learning contract. I'm going to agree to take a tutorial on the Google page. I'm going to practice some techniques, and I'm going to do so by a specified date. And these are all going to be the learning activities. They might be a lot more independent and query-based versus one building upon the next. And then, of course, for the evaluation, it's going to be more of a self-evaluation in mutual regard with the teacher or the instructor. Is just a way to enforce or reinforce, rather, if that learning was actually completed. So this was a quote that's going to be really hard to see in the video, but again, if you need the PowerPoint, let me know. But I thought this was a really good little quote to end with. Mr. Knowles writes in his book, originally I defined andragogy as the art and science of helping adults learn, in contrast to pedagogy as the art and science of teaching children. Then, an increasing number of teachers in elementary and secondary schools, and a few in colleges, began reporting to me that they were experimenting with applying the concepts of andragogy to the education of youth, and finding that in certain situations they were producing superior learning. So I am now at the point of seeing that andragogy is another set of assumptions about learners to be used alongside the pedagogical model of assumptions, therefore thereby providing two alternative models for testing out assumptions as they're fit with particular situations. I thought this was a particularly interesting quote because it reminds me, and I hope it will remind everybody, that andragogy is not better than pedagogy, but it's rather a spectrum, and one sits on one end of it and the other sits on the other end of it. And what it does is reminds us that adults and a lot of children fall somewhere along that spectrum depending on the task at hand. For example, if you've got an adult who is not tech savvy and is very apprehensive to use a particular software, for example, then a pedagogical frame point is really going to be good for them. However, if you have an adult who's coming to the table to learn public speaking techniques, we know that that's just what they want to learn, and they don't need to learn first about the history of public speaking and how to do, just a brief intro. They might want to know exactly how do I do public speaking as it relates to this particular task at hand. So in their form, they're going to meet the process elements, and they want to go from an andragogical model. So as I wrap this up, I want to say that I highly recommend everybody read this book at some point, if you have the time. If not, you really need to make the time at some point in your career. It's an easy read, and one of the things that I thought was great about Mr. Knowles is that his writing is very clear and simple. He doesn't write to be scholarly fancy. He writes to be scholarly practical, if that makes sense. It serves as a good reminder and reinforces everything that we should have learned in this program. Thanks.